Today, we interview Michael Pack, who is the man behind the Created Equal, Clarence Thomas, in his own words, documentary.
Judge Thomas, do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please be seated.
When I was 6, I wandered the streets by myself. You were hungry and didn't know when you'd eat. Someplace in my life, the road split off. I had gone to the seminary. I had gone to all white schools. I was never going to be a part of that world. I was never going to be white. The problem is I could never go back completely to the world I came from. We're supposed to be revolutionaries. We were for anybody who's kind of in your face. I saw what I had become, lashing out at every single thing. And then I asked God that if you take anger out of my heart, I'll never hate again. And that was the beginning of the slow return to where I started.
I want my candidacy to unify our country.
I was under constant attack. You're not really black because you're not doing what we expect black people to do.
That I will nominate Judge Clarence Thomas to serve as Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court.
That's when all heck broke loose.
Judge Thomas began to use work situations to discuss sex.
We know exactly what's going on here. This is the wrong black guy. He has to be destroyed. You really didn't matter. What mattered was what they wanted.
So you'd still like to serve on the Supreme Court?
I'd rather die than withdraw from the process. I wanted to be able to say I lived up to my oath and did my best.
Let's not forget, not only was his life difficult, but he was in the segregated South.
Wow.
But these segregated parochial schools were run by these Irish nuns who loved the children there and gave them more hard work, religious values, and Justice Thomas thrived in that environment. So much so that he wanted to be a priest, not something that a lot of people know about Justice Thomas, and actually entered the seminary. Now, the seminaries at that point were just desegregating. He was one of the first African Americans there. And in the seminary, he experienced some racism from the white seminarians, reaching a peak in 1968 when they were watching TV, and it was the day Martin Luther King Jr. was shot, and a white seminarian said, "I hope that son of a dies." I mean, a shocking thing, unthinkable today, and shocking to Justice Thomas at the time. He went and told his grandfather, his only real father figure, that he was not going to be a priest. And his grandfather said, "If you can make decisions like a man, you got to live like a man," and kicked him out of the house.
3, 2, 1, and...
Get ready to enter the Thrive Time Show.
We started from the bottom, now we hit. We started from the bottom, and we'll show you how to get here. We started from the bottom, now we hit. We started from the bottom, now we hit.
We started from the bottom, now we're on the top, teaching you the systems to get what we got. Colton Dixon's on the hooks, I break down the books. Z's bringing some wisdom and the good looks. As the father of 5, that's why I'm alive. So if you see my wife and kids, please tell them hi. It's the C&Z up on your radio, and now 3, 2, 1, here we go!
We started from the bottom, now we hit. We started from the bottom.
Yes, 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 and yes. Thrive Nation, on today's show, we are interviewing the man, the myth, and the legend, Michael Pack. Welcome on to the Thrive Time Show. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for having me on the show.
Hey, when I first heard about this project that you worked on here, this documentary called The Making of Created Equal, the Clarence Thomas, in his own words, story, I was immediately excited. But I wanted to ask you this. How did you first come in contact with Clarence Thomas? What was your history with U.S. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas?
Well, I first met him when I heard through mutual friends that Justice Thomas was getting tired of having his story and his legacy defined by his enemies and people on the left generally, and he the lies and untruths that were circulating about him. So I met with him, and at that time I knew little more about him than I could remember from his very contentious confirmation hearings in 1991. But after meeting with him and doing research, I discovered that he had a great personal story, well beyond just the confirmation hearings, I meant to say, well beyond his confirmation hearings. And I just was inspired to do the film. I really wanted to do the film, and I quickly came, or maybe not so quickly, came to the idea that it should be Clarence Thomas in his own words, and that is the subtitle, Created Equal, Clarence Thomas in his own words, meaning Justice Thomas was the ideal person to tell his story. So our format in our movie is he looks right at camera and tells viewers what it felt like to go through his life, starting from the very beginning and coming up to today.
My understanding is that Clarence Thomas, Judge Clarence Thomas, wandered the streets at the age of 6. I mean, he had a rough life growing up, but then, he was a very tenacious person. He's a hardworking person, but yet the media, the story that you heard if you watched CNN ever, or you watched most mainstream media, was very different. It was very, very different. What kind of lies and untrue stories were floating around Clarence Thomas, and could you contrast that to how he actually grew up?
Yeah, so he tells his story the true way, or at least the way he experienced it. So that's what you get. You get his subjective story in the film, and I think that what happened with Justice Thomas is that from the time he became a public figure up through today, people try to say that since he doesn't speak a lot in oral argument, doesn't give a lot of interviews, people are able to say that he doesn't speak a lot, he's misanthropic maybe, he's not smart, he's an affirmative action hire. I think if you spend 2 hours simply listening to him and hearing his story, you cannot still think that way. And no one who's seen the movie, whatever their politics, comes away with those myths, still believing those myths. And I believe people of all politics should see this movie. He has an amazing story, and he's a very important person, and people should try to understand who he is and why he thinks the way he does. So, but what you said, Clay, is very accurate. He had a very, very difficult beginning and many struggles throughout his life, and he tells that whole story. I mean, he was born in dire poverty in Pinpoint, Georgia, a Gullah-speaking area just outside of Savannah on the coast. So English wasn't really his first language. He spoke this Gullah dialect. His father left before he could remember. He kind of met him briefly when he was 8 years old, so this left a very big hole in his life. And then his mother, when he was 6, moved to Savannah. And then in Savannah, he went, as he says, from rural poverty to urban squalor. And that was the experience that you alluded to earlier. There, his mother worked as a maid, and he did not have enough to eat. He was cold in the winter. He didn't have a real bed to sleep in. He had to sleep in a chair. She would bring him to school, and because no one really cared, he would just leave school, and as you just said, he'd wander the streets of Savannah, alone, lost. And that went on for several years until his mother realized she couldn't really take care of him and his brother anymore, and brought them to her father, his grandfather, to raise. And that really turned his life around. His grandfather was really the seminal figure in his life.
I grew up hearing things about him that were so terrible. I hate to even speak about him because I don't want to give any power to it. But I grew up being told that essentially he was only invited to be a U.S. Supreme Court judge because they needed a black guy, and that he didn't like women. I mean, that was the narrative that was painted out there. How does a narrative like that catch on? How does that happen for people who don't understand the media's role in shaping how we perceive people? Michael, how does that happen?
Well, that we do portray at some length in the film. And let me just say to the listeners of your podcast, if they want to see the film, they have to go to our website, justicethomasmovie.com. It's currently playing in 40 theaters around the country, but it won't keep playing unless your listeners actually go to the theater and buy tickets. Or let's put it this way, they at least have to buy tickets. So, and if it's not in a theater near them, there's a place on the website to sign up, and if we get a big enough group of 40 or 50, we can make an event happen near where they are.
Got it.
but they got to go. I mean, even if it's 30, 40 minutes away, I appeal to them to go if you want stories like this to be in your local movie theater. Now, in terms of the myths about him, so, after he had a very difficult life, which we should talk about a little bit, he finally, so in order to understand where the myths came from, it's important to have a little sense of what his actual dimensions of his life were. Yeah. So after he had this period, after he was brought to his grandfather gave him tough love, hard work, and sent him to parochial schools, then segregated. Let's not forget, not only was his life difficult, but he was in the segregated South.
Wow.
But these segregated parochial schools were run by these Irish nuns who loved the children there and gave them more hard work, religious values, and Justice Thomas thrived in that environment, so much so that he wanted to be a priest, not something that a lot of people know about Justice Thomas, and actually entered the seminary.
Really?
Yes. I mean, you asked about how important faith is in his life. So he entered the seminary. Now, the seminaries at that point were just desegregating. He was one of the first African Americans there. And in the seminary, he experienced some racism from the white seminarians, reaching a peak in 1968 when they were watching TV, and it was the day Martin Luther King Jr. was shot, and a white seminarian said, "I hope that son of a dies." I mean, a shocking thing, unthinkable today, and shocking to Justice Thomas at the time. And he was already thinking that the church was not doing enough for civil rights, and so he just then flipped. He suddenly decided race and racism explained everything. He became what he calls an angry black man. He went and told his grandfather, his only real father figure, that he was not going to be a priest. And his grandfather said, if you can make decisions like a man, you've got to live like a man, and kicked him out of the house. Wow. So there he is, lost again. I mean, lost again, and sort of without direction, without faith. And so he has to go wherever people will take him in. And he happens to have a full scholarship at Holy Cross, a Jesuit school in Worcester, Massachusetts, and he goes there, but he continues his radicalism. He helps form the Black Student Union. They invite a Black Panther to speak. He supports everybody, as he says, the more in your face, the better, from Angela Davis to Malcolm X. And it's only by he kind of hits a kind of bottom eventually during this radical period. He goes to an anti-war rally in Cambridge nearby, and it turns into a riot, and he gets caught up in the spirit of the mob, the violent spirit of the mob, and he sees what he's become. And when he gets back to Holy Cross well after midnight, everything is closed, but he kneels in front of the chapel. He had not prayed in a long time. He kneels in front of the chapel and says, prays to God, and says, if you will take anger out of my heart, I will never hate again. And that's the beginning of his coming back to faith.
Wow.
And then it takes many more years before he comes back, becomes conservative. He experienced the failure of a lot of the social programs and ideas that he once supported, like affirmative action, like busing in nearby Boston. And finally, he goes to work he votes for Ronald Reagan finally in 1980, his first Republican, and goes to work in the Reagan administration. And to him, he's come back to both the values politically and also spiritually of his grandfather and the Irish nuns who raised him. But once he works for Ronald Reagan, this is perhaps a long answer to your question, Clay. Once he goes back to work for Ronald Reagan, then he's a public figure. He's identified as an African-American who supports Reagan, a conservative black man. And as he said, that's not something you're allowed to do. He was then, as he says, off the reservation. And then he starts being attacked, well before his confirmation hearing. And those attacks start then and continue to this day, and they often involve racist stereotypes and imagery, ones that you could not apply to someone on the other side of the political spectrum. And that's where you get a lot of these misunderstandings. And even beginning before Anita Hill, So that's where it all begins. We could go into it in greater detail, but that's where it starts.
Why do you feel, again, because you sat down and made this documentary that everybody can see by going to justicethomasmovie.com, justicethomasmovie.com. You sat down with this man for a long time to interview him. Why is the notion of being a conservative black man so far-fetched for most people?
That is a very good question. It's true that we interviewed him a long time. I was lucky that Justice Thomas granted me a 30-hour interview over 6 months, and I interviewed only Justice Thomas and his wife, Ginny.
Wow.
And they're the only ones speaking because it's Justice Thomas telling his story. And no one has had that kind of access to a Supreme Court justice, so it was a real privilege. I mean, as far as why you're attacked like that, let me tell you the story of one notorious attack even in the 80s. So Harding Carter, who's a prominent Southern journalist and had a high position in the President Jimmy Carter administration, wrote an article in Playboy in the 80s while Justice Thomas was working in the Reagan administration and said he called him a chicken-eating preacher gathering crumbs at the white man's table. Nakedly racist language that you could not apply to anyone else, and no one defended him. He was deemed, as he said, the wrong kind of black man. He had views you weren't supposed to have. He opposed affirmative action and quotas. He didn't believe in busing. He took an originalist approach to the Constitution even then. So these were not the views you were supposed to have. And once you had those, everyone felt free to attack you in the most vicious way possible. I mean, it is not an appealing aspect of American cultural life. It is in some ways hard to explain. Justice Thomas doesn't analyze it. He sort of explains how he lived through it. I mean, the film is really not analytical. It's a story. It's his story of his life as he experienced it. And viewers can draw their own conclusions about Justice Thomas and about why things happened to him.
Can you, we have a lot of, most people who listen to this show own companies. They own businesses. That's who our audience is. For the listeners out there who are not familiar with what affirmative action is or what it was, could you kind of just on a high level, kind of third grade level, kind of explain to us what affirmative action was all about and what Judge Thomas's view was on affirmative action?
That's a good question. And affirmative action is really, it can mean many, many things. Originally, affirmative action meant simply that if you wanted to hire, for instance, more African Americans, you, in your job search, went and looked harder for them. That's the kind of affirmative action that Justice Thomas supports.
Got it.
And he felt that, for instance, Holy Cross did that they sent recruiters out to parts of the country where there had not been recruiters looking for talented African Americans. That's one kind of affirmative action. But it quickly turned into quotas. And that's the kind of affirmative action that Justice Thomas does not believe in.
Quotas.
Where there's at least numerical targets. Quotas
Got it.
are often deemed to be impermissible, so institutions look for ways for things that are like quotas, or just different standards for one group than another. So our film is called Created Equal because the Declaration of Independence is very important to Justice Thomas, and it says all men are created equal, and they're endowed by their Creator, by God, with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But so created equal, and that is finally in the Constitution. In, for instance, the Equal Protection Clause. So Justice Thomas would say that any kind of separate plans, separate standards for different based on race would be unconstitutional. And as he says in our film, even if discrimination based on race is unconstitutional and wrong, whether you think it's good or bad discrimination. Because who's to say it's good or bad? As Justice Thomas says, originally, the separate but equal schools, segregated schools, those people whites who did that claimed it was good for African Americans. They claimed it was good discrimination. So once you allow discrimination based on race, even if you think you're doing it for a good reason, there's no way to control it. There's no way to make sure it's truly good. There is no standard for that. We live in a democracy governed by the Constitution and laws, and that's not the right way to do it. So that's more or less how he sees it.
Now, you mentioned that in the film, which all of our viewers can watch by going to justicethomasmovie.com, that we'll get to know that the character of a man who has originalist views of the Constitution. Could you explain what that means? Because I think there's a lot of people that don't understand the power that the Supreme Court now has, and it's interesting how if you don't have an originalist view, how you could change the narrative of the country very quickly. Can you please explain what it means to have an originalist view of the Constitution?
Well, as Justice Thomas says, when we quote one of his opinions where he defines it as it is to adhere to the public understanding of the Constitution or the amendments at the time they were written. How do people really understand those words? And he would say that if you don't like that, you need to amend the Constitution again. So, if you don't have a standard, if you can define it so loosely that anything that you think is good is constitutional and everything bad is unconstitutional, it's as if you have no written law or Constitution at all. As Justice Thomas says in the movie, and it's quite true, that good laws can be unconstitutional and bad laws can be constitutional. The Constitution is not there to determine what's good or bad. The maker of good and bad laws is supposed to be the Congress. They make the laws, and they're supposed to decide what is good and bad. The Supreme Court is there to decide what's constitutional or not. Just like we're talking about, Clay, in the terms of affirmative action. Even good discrimination is wrong. It's unconstitutional. It is wrong to discriminate based on race. It is wrong, and it is unconstitutional, even if you're doing it for a good reason. So that's why I think originalism is important. I mean, Justice Thomas was also very close to Antonin Scalia, who's also closely connected to the originalist philosophy. And as Mrs. Thomas says in the film, Antonin Scalia called Clarence Thomas a bloodthirsty originalist, which he took as a compliment. But there are significant differences even within originalism. Justice Thomas is willing to look towards the principles of the Declaration of Independence, whereas Justice Scalia wants to be solely defined by the four corners of the Constitution. But in general, they adhere to this originalist interpretation, and I think that's a very important movement in judicial philosophy.
1990, President George Bush nominated Thomas for a seat on the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. Can you please explain why there was such outrage when he was asked to be a Supreme Court justice? Why there was just what did the other side fear? Why was there such outrage?
Well, it's true he had just been an appellate judge, just like as you said, but there was, and in fact, Joe Biden said when he was confirmed for the appeals court that it's fine for the appeals court, but he should not think about going to the Supreme Court. And I think the controversy relates to what we've been talking about earlier. He had the wrong views on many things, but particularly once he was nominated by George W. Bush, a concerted campaign was mounted to stop him. And I think the driving impulse of it was a feeling that he would have what these women's groups especially thought would be the wrong views on abortion and might reverse Roe versus Wade. And they started a very big program against him. They lobbied. They spread. There was an attempt to spread lots of rumors in the media. He was accused of smoking marijuana, of being anti-Semitic, and he had to bat back all those rumors. And then he had a very contentious 5 days of hearings before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and there was a big effort, a big focus on the abortion question. And then when that part of the hearing ended, the Senate Judiciary Committee voted. Remember, this is a Senate controlled by the Democrats. The committee is chaired by Joe Biden. And this committee split 7-7, with some Democrats voting for him, and they sent his name forward to the full Senate to vote. And it was at that moment that the Anita Hill charges were leaked to the press. to Newsday and NPR. And based on those leaks, the Senate decided to reconvene the Judiciary Committee. They couldn't vote again. They had already voted to hold another set of hearings into her charges. And as Justice Thomas says, it's like you finished a marathon and you relaxed, and suddenly you're told you've got to run another marathon. And these charges, very explosive at the time. It's worth remembering in the context of today. I mean, we're in the midst of the Weinstein trial, that Anita Hill's charges were not physical assault. She accused Justice Thomas of inappropriate language in the workplace, talking about pornographic films and other things that definitely are sexual harassment, but they're not in the physical touching category. But they were shocking at the time, and it was shocking at the time to have those things discussed in the Senate. And Justice Thomas denied those charges, and there was pressure on George H.W. Bush to ask him to withdraw, but George W. Bush did not bow to that pressure. And there was pressure on Justice Thomas to, try to make nice to the Senate, but he came back strongly denying the charges, fighting very hard for his reputation. He gave a very dramatic speech about calling the proceedings a high-tech lynching against the advice of his handlers, who said you can't attack senators if you want them to vote for you. But he felt it was a matter of honor. He felt he was protecting the values that his grandfather and the Irish nuns he loved instilled in him and their legacy. And he fought very hard, and at the end of that part of the hearing, the Senate voted to confirm him, 52 to 48, but the country as a whole believed Justice Thomas 2-1, including African Americans and including women. But as you were saying earlier, Clay, the attacks on him did not cease once he got to the Supreme Court. They continued, as well as many efforts to tell his story falsely and from a different perspective. And now I'd say the numbers reversed. I mean, within a year or two, the numbers had reversed.
If you're unless you're living under a rock right now, I'm sure you've seen President Trump's Twitter feed at some point, and you've seen that when anybody attacks him, his line he likes to say is, "If you hit me once, I'll punch you twice." Clarence Thomas has not said anything about this entire thing for, I believe, over a decade. Why has he not said anything for over a decade, and how did you convince him to say a lot of things for 30 hours as you were making this documentary?
Well, I think he's very reluctant to give interviews to the media. He was really burned by the media during that confirmation battle. There were a lot of false stories told about him. He's very distrustful of the media for obvious reasons, and he also doesn't speak in oral argument for reasons that he gives in the documentary. So there's the impression that he doesn't speak, but and that has allowed other people to define him, and I think he just got tired of it. I mean, he did write a memoir about over 10 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
But I mean, people don't read that many books, sadly.
True.
So he's been defined by other media. And I think that he had this feeling for a while that if he does his job as a Supreme Court and he has an influence that way, he has written over 600 opinions, 30% more, way more than any other sitting Supreme Court justice. He's very active in the writing aspect of the court. He's very active behind the scenes in the court. He's clearly a powerful figure on the court, and even more so now. And he felt that was enough. But there were so many of these efforts to define him that it reached a peak. And at some point, he was just willing to tell his story. I am very lucky that he was willing to let us do it. And I think this is the time. I mean, he's been on the court since 1991, a long time. This is the right moment to tell his story. I think the Kavanaugh hearing, which followed a very similar playbook to the Justice Thomas hearing, brought his own hearing back, and I think it's in a way that it is often untrue. So this is the right time to both set the record straight in one way. But I also feel that I, as a filmmaker, want to tell his story because I think it's bigger than just what's the truth about Justice Thomas. I think his story is a story of overcoming adversity, of resilience in the face of many setbacks, from his poverty and and Jim Crow discrimination growing up, to being on the being thrown out by his grandfather, or losing his faith and gaining his faith. And I think it's finally, Justice Thomas' story is an inspiring story, and especially for young people, but really for all people and for people of whatever political view.
Michael, I have two final questions I want to ask you, and then I have a couple people here with me that had some rapid-fire questions for you. You make films, and I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but you're not supposed to make films like this as a filmmaker. I'm not sure if you're aware of the rule. You're supposed to write lefty films, do lefty documentaries, left-handed documentaries only. What is your background, and when did you feel like you could actually make a movie that's right-leaning?
Well, I grew up in New York City, and after college I came back to New York City and took some film courses at NYU and went into the film business. But as soon as, like Justice Thomas, I was on the left when I was growing up, and I only gradually became politically conservative. I'd say in the late 70s, like Justice Thomas, I too voted for Ronald Reagan. But a lot of my friends and colleagues making documentaries were making left-leaning documentaries. I mean, at that time, they were pro-nuclear freeze, even pro-Soviet, radical environmental documentaries, etc. And a partner and I wanted to make alternative documentaries. And right away, we started to do that. I formed my company, Manifold Productions, in 1977, and its purpose was to make documentaries that would have another voice. You are right. The dominant, almost exclusive voice is on the left, not a healthy thing in a country like a democracy like ours. And my first major documentary for PBS, I have made over 15 documentaries in that period. All have been nationally broadcast by PBS. And the first one in 1987 was called Hollywood's Favorite Heavy, and it was why Hollywood television, but movies and television, but we focused on television, always pick businessmen as the villains. This was the heyday of Dallas and Dynasty, but it has continued unabated to today. Why in a country where capitalism has created so much wealth, why are businessmen the villains? So we went to talk to the people in Hollywood who were making these television shows to get their views of business and to see why they picked businessmen as the villains. So that was way back in '87, and we made a whole series of films that question perhaps the prevailing liberal biases of my fellow documentary filmmakers that you outlined.
Yeah.
And I encourage your listeners to go watch any of our films. They're on our website, a different website, manifoldproductions.com.
How do you spell
they
that?
Can all be purchased there. MANIFOLD Productions with an S.com.
Got it.
And they're all listed. They're all great. But the first one they should see is definitely the one that's in movie theaters now, so it's easier to see.
Yep.
The Created Equal, and for that they've got to go to the justicethomasmovie.com website.
My final question for you, and then I'll let Dr. Breck, the chiropractor, hit you with a question here. My final question for you is, when are you and Michael Moore going to team up to do a Michael Moore versus Michael Pack documentary, where he does one about you, you do one about him, and we have to go back and forth and watch it? When are you doing that?
That would be fun. I have to say, Michael Moore, I mean, I think he is a very talented documentary filmmaker.
Yeah.
His movies, he's sort of doing the same thing now for many years, but they can be funny, but they are so biased. I mean, I hope I do not make that kind of film. I don't feel I'm like the Michael Moore of the right. I mean, I think his films are advocacy, films of a sort.
You're not saying this, but I'm saying this. I think that Michael Moore thinks that any film that is not far left is super far right. That's my worldview of Michael Moore. I know you're not saying that, but I would love to see you do one, Michael Moore versus Michael Pack.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to do that. If Michael Moore can call me anytime.
Okay, Dr. Breck, what questions do you have for Michael Pack about the upcoming release of the film Created Equal? Clarence Thomas, in his own words.
Well, Michael, one of my questions is about the outlets that your movies are being shown in. How difficult has it been to get your documentaries into places that are typically really only servicing the left side of the commentary?
Well, I've had a good relationship with PBS my whole career.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is difficult, and it has become more difficult. But I believe people on the right can get their films on PBS. It's hard, but I think it's possible, and I think they should do that. I think that I think the underlying your question, I think, is the right, correct assumption that it's harder for right-of-center filmmakers to get their work out there. And that's true. I mean, even looking for a distributor for our film, many of them turned us down because of politics. Mm-hmm. Without even looking at the film.
Got it.
And there were film festivals that said, don't bother to submit. As long as that's your topic, you'll never get into this film festival. Save your entry fee. You know, which is nice when people are honest. At least it saves trouble. But it reveals a strong bias. And I think you'll see that in the Academy Awards tonight. I mean, people get up and give speeches, and their speeches often have a political tinge, and the political tinge is only in one direction.
Right.
So I think it is hard. I think, however, it is really bad for people, conservatives, people right of center, to simply forsake the cultural arena and leave it to the left. I think it doesn't have to be that way. But one reason it is that way is because the left cares about films and documentaries and arts in general, and they show up. So a parallel documentary to ours, the film about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, RBG, was a huge success in theaters and then was aired nationally by CNN. And I appeal to the listeners of this podcast to actually go. I mean, the ones that are sympathetic to Justice Thomas's point of view, including and ones who aren't, but surely the ones who are, to actually buy tickets to show up, even if they have to drive a while to get there. And this day, Sunday, is an important day. If it's not on, doesn't do well this weekend, it may not be in as many theaters next week.
Well, in concerns with Justice Thomas, do you believe that he felt like time would resolve some of that as far as his silence for allowing his detractors to kind of be the voice or to set the narrative?
Well, I think he does think that time will help, but I think it got to a point where it was getting worse and worse, and I think now we have this film, and I think the film will make an impact. And I think that beyond its being in theaters or streaming, whatever it ends up doing, I really feel strongly, both my wife and I, we are both together at our film company, feel strongly that the film needs to be shown in every high school during Black History Month, February, this month. There's a lot of curriculum, like you might say left-leaning curriculum, targeting schools for Black History Month. There's this New York Times-based 1619 project, Black Lives Matter, have a curriculum. Amidst all this other curriculum, they need young people, and especially young African-American people, need to hear this kind of story of a conservative African-American and somebody who chooses not to define himself as a victim.
Jason, what question do you have for Michael Pack?
Well, one, it was really awesome being able to sit in and listen to this entire story because I may not sound like it, but I am an African-American male. And so hearing the story of Clarence Thomas and, where he started, all the trials and tribulations he went through, and then to come forward and make a piece like this, I checked it out on the website. This is playing in Quail Springs. I'm going to see it. So it's about an hour and a half drive. Don't care. Want to check this movie out. But my question is, so after having done this, do you guys have anything else in the pipeline as far as making more socio-political movies, or like what's the focus as far as directing going forward?
That's a good question, and I do appreciate your driving. It is true. It's at the AMC Quail Springs Mall in Oklahoma City, and I know that's a long way from Tulsa. So that willingness to drive all that way is just what I'm asking from the other listeners. I really appreciate that. I think that's great. Let me know what you think when you see it. We hope to release next a film that we produced a few years ago, and it was actually primarily funded from public broadcasting, but PBS elected not to air it, the first time ever for us. And it's about the biggest battles in the Iraq War, Fallujah and Najaf in 2003. And it aims to tell the story from a battlefield point of view, as if it were Gettysburg or Iwo Jima. Not politics, but how the battles were fought and why, not just from the grunt point of view, but not only, all the way up to the sort of generals who were running it, including General Mattis. And I think if we ask our young men and women to go fight for this country and die for it, we have to at least try to understand how that happened. And I think they come off as heroic, idealistic young people. These battles are complex, and they have good and bad aspects to them, and I think it's important to understand. So we hope to get that out next. We've had a lot of people in the military, and especially the Marine Corps, who are very prominently featured in these battles, waiting for us to release the film. So I hope to do that next.
My final question we have here for you, Michael, is Nathan. He owns a carpet cleaning business, and he's a listener to the Thrive Time show. Nathan, what final question do you have here for Michael Pack?
Oh, thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it, Michael. My daughter has done film in high school for the last couple of years, and I've helped her with a few projects. And so my question to you is, I read on the website that you and your wife, Virginia, worked together to take the 30 hours and turn it into a movie. That had to be quite the process. So what did you go through? Like, what was the process to get 30 hours of information condensed down into the movie that you created?
That is a good question. I mean, so Clarence Thomas's wife's name is Virginia. My wife's name is Gina. Clarence Thomas' wife goes by Ginny, and my wife goes by Gina. So they could be confused, but they're very different. Both great women.
Yeah.
Well, we did have the 30 hours. I have to say, look, the documentaries are a collaborative process, and I work with a great editor, Faith Jones, and we worked over a year editing the movie, a long time.
Wow.
It was very hard to boil it down to 2 hours. My wife, since you bring her up, actually always thought the film should be 90 minutes, which is a much better length for a film, and especially a documentary, but it was hard to get it down to 2 hours. He has a very complex story, as you can get a sense of from our talk. It was a hard process. It was a complicated, difficult process. We did a lot of times where we showed it to groups of people to get their response, and it's not easy. So you have to really be committed to making it work, whatever it takes, and however long it takes, and however difficult it takes. I mean, it's a struggle to make every documentary film, and you have to struggle and struggle until you've done it.
Michael, I appreciate you so much for creating this film that all of our listeners can check out again at justicethomasmovie.com, justicethomasmovie.com. And thank you for lending us a little bit of your time on this morning. And again, we appreciate you so much, and I hope you have a great day.
It was fun talking to you. Thanks.
And now, without any further ado, 3, 2, 1, boom!